In March 2002, a teenage girl appeared at a neighbor's door in Kitakyushu, Japan. She was covered in injuries. She had been held captive for years. She told police what had happened. Between 1996 and 1998, 7 people had been killed in a series of apartments across Kitakyushu and Fukuoka. The victims included 2 children. 6 of the 7 victims were members of the same family. They had not been killed by a stranger. They had been killed by each other, forced to kill their own relatives by a man named Matsunaga Futoshi, who used electric shock, starvation, and psychological control so complete that he could instruct a parent to kill their child and the parent would comply. Police found no human remains. The bodies had been dismembered, boiled in pots, and disposed of in drains and in the sea. Japan's prosecutors said the case was without comparison in the criminal history of the country. Most Japanese media refused to report the details. Matsunaga blamed the women. He was sentenced to death. He is still alive, on death row, insisting it was not him. Matsunaga Futoshi was born in 1961 in Kitakyushu, Fukuoka Prefecture. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him in his earlier years, charming, articulate, good grades in school, a facility with language and persuasion that he had recognized as a tool from an early age. He was also manipulative, controlling, and willing to use violence when charm failed. He married at 19. He had affairs with at least 10 other women while married. He ran a series of small businesses, a futon company, later other enterprises, that were, in several cases, vehicles for fraud. He had a prior conviction for fraud that had resulted in a fine. In 1982, he began an affair with Ogata Junko, a former schoolmate. What he did to Ogata Junko over the following years was the template for everything that followed. He isolated her. He cut her off from her family, systematically undermining her relationships, intercepting her communications, making himself the only significant person in her world. He used physical violence to establish that resistance had consequences. And he used electric shock, a specifically adapted device that delivered painful but usually non-lethal charges, as the primary instrument of behavioral control. The electric shock device was central to his method. It established, with immediate physical reality, that compliance was less painful than resistance. It was used for punishment. It was used for maintenance, regular applications to remind the subject of their situation. And it was used for something more sinister, to condition the people in his orbit to a specific psychological state in which his instructions were followed not through fear alone but through a more complete dissolution of individual will. Criminologists and psychologists who have analyzed the case have described Matsunaga's method as one of the most sophisticated examples of coercive control documented in Japanese criminal history. He did not simply frighten people into compliance. He rebuilt them. He rebuilt Ogata Junko so thoroughly that she became his accomplice, a woman who had herself been his victim and who had nonetheless participated in the torture and killing of her own family members at his direction. Whether she was a perpetrator or a victim, or both simultaneously, has been the central legal and moral question of the case since her arrest. By the early 1990s, Matsunaga had developed his method into a system. The system had rules. Everyone in his orbit was required to report to him. Conversations without his knowledge were prohibited. Contact with people outside the group was forbidden. The electric shock device was present in every shared living space. Its use was unpredictable enough to maintain constant anxiety and predictable enough to establish clear behavioral expectations. He used the device on Ogata Junko. He had Ogata Junko use it on others. He had others use it on each other. The specific act of being made to administer electric shock to someone else, to be an instrument of someone else's pain at another person's instruction, was not incidental to the method. It was the method. It implicated everyone in the violence. It created shared guilt. It made resistance harder because resistance would require confronting not just the controller but one's own participation in what had been done. By the time the murders began in 1996, Matsunaga had been refining this system for a decade. If this history is new to you, subscribe to Unsolved East and hit like. New episodes every week. The murders began in 1996 with Kumio, a man whose daughter Matsunaga had taken into his orbit. Kumio had been brought into the group to be closer to his daughter, who was being held in Matsunaga's apartment. What he found instead was confinement, torture, and eventual death. Matsunaga subjected Kumio to electric shocks, forced humiliation, and systematic degradation over an extended period. Kumio died. The specific cause of death, whether he was killed directly or died from the accumulated effects of the torture, has been difficult to establish definitively because of the disposal of his remains. In December 1997, Matsunaga ordered Ogata Junko to administer electric shocks to her own father, Takashige, until he died. She did. When Junko's mother, Shizumi, became mentally unstable from the stress of what she was witnessing and experiencing, Matsunaga ordered Junko's sister Riko and Riko's husband Kanzuya to strangle her. They did. A few weeks later, Matsunaga ordered Kanzuya to strangle Riko while their daughter Aya assisted. He did. Matsunaga then confined Kanzuya in a bathroom without food or water. Kanzuya died of starvation in April 1998. Matsunaga then ordered Junko and Aya, Riko's daughter, who was approximately 10 years old, to kill Riko's 5-year-old son, Yuki. They did. On June 7, 1998, Kumio's daughter, who had been held captive in the apartment throughout this period, strangled Aya at Matsunaga's instruction. She was the last to die. 7 people. 2 children. 6 of them were members of Ogata Junko's family: her father, her mother, her sister, her brother-in-law, and her sister's 2 children. Matsunaga and Junko dismembered the bodies. They boiled the remains in pots. They disposed of them in drains and from a ferry into the sea. Police found no human remains. The victims exist in the case record primarily through the testimony of survivors, Kumio's daughter and others who had been held in the apartments, and through the confessions and statements of Junko herself. The specific psychological question that the Kitakyushu case poses has occupied Japanese criminologists since the trial. How does a person administer fatal electric shocks to their own father? How does a 10-year-old participate in the killing of her 5-year-old brother? The answers that the case suggests, and that the testimony of survivors and the psychiatric evaluations of Junko have produced, are not simple. Matsunaga's control over the people in his orbit was not maintained primarily through the direct threat of violence, though the electric shock device made that threat physically present and real. It was maintained through something more complete, a restructuring of the subject's understanding of their own situation that made compliance seem like survival and resistance seem like destruction. People in his orbit did not experience themselves as captives making terrible choices under duress. They experienced themselves as participants in a group whose rules had to be followed or something worse would happen. The something worse was defined by Matsunaga and was different for each person. For Junko, it was the threat of what would happen to her if she did not cooperate. For the family members who were brought in later, it was the accumulated effect of weeks and months of isolation, electric shock conditioning, sleep deprivation, and the specific psychological restructuring that these methods produce in individuals who have no outside contact to provide a reality check. The question of where coercion ends and complicity begins, the question at the center of Ogata Junko's legal case, has never been fully answered. The courts produced an answer. Whether it was the right answer is a different question. The trial of Matsunaga Futoshi and Ogata Junko produced one of the most complex culpability questions in Japanese legal history. Matsunaga denied everything. He claimed that the women in the case had fabricated their stories about him. He claimed that the murders had been committed by Junko and others without his knowledge or direction. He maintained this position throughout the trial, through the appeals process, and continues to maintain it. The evidence against him was the testimony of survivors, primarily Kumio's daughter, who had been held captive throughout the murder period and who provided the account that led to his arrest, and the testimony of Junko herself, who confessed to her participation and described Matsunaga's role. The court found Matsunaga guilty of 6 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter. He was sentenced to death in 2008 after the trial and appeals process concluded. He remains on death row. Japan's death sentences are carried out with no advance notice, at the discretion of the justice minister. As of 2024, Matsunaga has been on death row for over 15 years. Ogata Junko's case presented a different and more difficult problem. She had confessed. She had described her participation in the deaths of her own family members in detail. She had acknowledged using the electric shock device on people at Matsunaga's direction. She had acknowledged being present for and participating in multiple killings. She had also been a victim of Matsunaga's methods for years before the murders began. The court found Junko guilty and sentenced her to life imprisonment, a sentence that reflected the court's finding that her culpability, while genuine, was significantly mitigated by the coercive control to which she had been subjected. Whether the balance the court struck between perpetration and victimhood was correct, whether Junko was more victim than perpetrator, or more perpetrator than victim, or so thoroughly both that neither category adequately captures her situation, is a question that has continued to be debated in Japanese legal and criminological literature since the verdict. The case was adapted into a Netflix film, The Forest of Love, directed by Shaun Sono, in 2019. The film reached audiences in countries where the original case had never been reported. Matsunaga Futoshi is on death row in Japan. He has been there since 2008. He continues to say it was not him. The survivors, Kumio's daughter, who escaped and whose testimony produced the arrest, have rebuilt their lives in whatever way is possible after what they experienced. The specific experience of surviving years of captivity, of being made to participate in violence at the instruction of a controller, of emerging into a world that initially did not fully understand what they were describing, this is the experience that the Kitakyushu case imposed on the people who lived through it. Ogata Junko is serving a life sentence. She killed her father. She killed her family members. She did it at a man's instruction, using methods he had developed and applied to her for years before he turned them outward to her relatives. The question of whether she was a victim, a perpetrator, or something that requires a different category than either of those words provides has not been fully answered by the verdict. The Japan Times said the case was without comparison in the criminal history of the country. Japanese media, for the most part, declined to report the details. Netflix made a film about it. The specific question the case raises, the one that the verdict addressed but did not resolve, is the question of what happens to human agency under conditions of total coercive control. Whether there is a threshold beyond which choice becomes something that no longer deserves the name. Matsunaga found that threshold and worked beyond it. For 2 years, he instructed people to kill their own families. They did. He says it wasn't him. He is waiting for a day that comes with no warning, in a country where the condemned are not told in advance. The families that were destroyed do not have that uncertainty. They know exactly when it happened.